She was 22 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a leather satchel she had stitched herself from a piece of harness leather her teacher had left behind. She had a change of clothes, a tin cup, a folded blanket the color of winter grass, and $11.40 sewn into the lining of her coat, the last of what she had earned cleaning and mending for a household that no longer wanted her. And with those $11, she did something that every sensible person in Caldwell County, Texas, would have told her was either brave or foolish, and that most of them would have called both. She bought a mill, not a working mill, not a mill with a wheel still turning, or a millstone still seated, or a roof that kept out the rain. She bought the ruins of a grist mill on the Blanco River that had sat empty since the flood of 1878 washed out the dam and took the eastern wall with it, and that the county had been trying to unload for 6 years on anyone willing to pay the back taxes and relieve them of the paperwork. The asking price was $11. She paid it in full, and what nobody in that county knew, what she herself would not discover until she pressed her hands against a wall she was trying to save, was that someone had sealed something inside that mill before they left, and what she found inside that wall would change the course of everything that came after. We want you to stay with us through this one, because this is a story about what a person can build from nothing, and about what the dead sometimes leave behind for the living, and about the kind of help that comes quietly, without ceremony, from people who have been waiting without knowing it to be needed. Her name was Clover Hatch, and she was born in the spring of 1861 in a riverbend town called Seguin, the only child of a woman named Bess Hatch, who had been a laundress her whole adult life and who raised Clover alone after the child's father left before the girl could speak his name. Bess was not a bitter woman, but she was a practical one, the kind of woman who kept a dry sense of humor and wet hands, and who taught her daughter early that the world does not give you what you deserve. It gives you what you are prepared to take care of. Bess Hatch died of a lung sickness when Clover was 13, quietly and over the course of a winter, in the back room of a boarding house where they had been living since the landlord of their previous place raised the rent past what a laundress could manage. Clover held her mother's hand at the end and listened to her breathe slower and slower, and finally stop, like a clock that had simply run down. And she sat there for a long time after, in the dark, not ready yet to knock on the door and tell anyone. What came after that was the usual machinery of a child left alone in the world. A county home. A placement with a farming family named Greer, who needed help with their 7 children, and their chickens, and their vegetable garden, and their floors, which were always dirty. The Greers were not cruel. They were simply people who needed more labor than they could pay for, and who had found in the county placement system a way to obtain it at the cost of meals and a pallet in the corner of the kitchen. Clover stayed 2 years and learned a great deal about hard work and very little about kindness. The person who changed that was a woman named Opal Dunmore, who operated a saddlery and leather works on the main road outside of Lockhart, and who came to the Greer farm one autumn afternoon to replace a broken harness. Clover was 15 and was splitting wood in the yard when Opal arrived, and Opal watched her for a moment before saying anything, watched the way she set the log and swung the axe and stacked what she split without pausing, and then said, "You know how to work. Do you want to learn something worth working at?" Clover said yes before she had finished hearing the question. Opal Dunmore was 53 years old, widowed, childless, and the best leather worker in 3 counties. She had learned the trade from her father, who had learned it from his, and she practiced it with a rigor and an attention to detail that most craftsmen reserved for things they considered important, which in Opal's view was everything she touched. She could cut and stitch a saddle that would outlast the horse that wore it. She could braid a rawhide rope so tight it would not stretch in rain. She could tool a pattern into leather, so fine you could read it with your eyes closed. She took Clover on as an apprentice in the autumn of 1876 and spent the next 4 years teaching her everything. Clover learned to select hides, to feel for thinness and scarring, and the places where the leather would not hold a stitch. She learned to soak and stretch and dry in oil, to use an awl without splitting, to pull a waxed thread through leather so the seam sat flat and would not catch. She learned to skeeve an edge, so thin it disappeared into itself, to set a rivet that would never work loose, to read the grain of a piece of cowhide, the way a carpenter reads the grain of wood, understanding where it wanted to bend and where it would crack if you pushed too hard. She learned to tool patterns, to stamp and swivel and gouge, to produce from a plain brown hide a surface of intricate geometry, that caught light the way carved wood does, with depth and shadow and intention. Opal taught her other things too: how to keep accounts, how to deal with customers who believed that a woman's work was worth less than a man's because the hands that produced it were smaller, how to say, in the flat, unhurried voice that Opal had perfected over 30 years, "You can take it or leave it, but this is my price and it is fair," and then wait in silence until the customer decided, and not apologize while they decided. She taught Clover once, on a slow afternoon when the summer heat had emptied the road outside, and they were oiling a finished saddle together, that the most important thing about making something with your hands was not the skill, though skill mattered. It was the intention, the understanding that what you made would outlast you, that the stitches you set today would hold a saddle on a horse's back 10 years from now, on some road you would never see, ridden by someone you would never meet, and that this was not a reason to be careless. It was the opposite. Opal Dunmore died in the summer of 1881, without warning, from a stoppage of the heart, while she was marking a piece of leather she planned to cut in the morning. She was found the next day at her workbench, the silver marking stylus still in her hand and the leather half-marked beneath it, and the lamp burned down to nothing. She had no family to leave the shop to. She had a will, written in her own hand and witnessed by the county clerk, that left the building and its contents to a nephew in San Antonio, who had visited once in 15 years and had no interest in leather. The nephew sold the shop and its tools within a month to a man who converted it to a feed store. Clover was not mentioned in the will, because Opal had not thought she needed to be. She had assumed, with the comfortable assumption of someone who has always been healthy, that there would be time to arrange things properly. There was not. What Clover had was the knowledge, 4 years of it, settled into her hands and her eyes, and her sense of proportion so completely that it was no longer something she had learned, but something she was. And she had one tool, the tool Opal had pressed into her hands 3 days before she died, on a morning when Opal had said she wasn't feeling right, and had sat down in the chair by the window and told Clover to keep working, and had watched her work with an expression that Clover had not known how to read at the time, but understood later as the expression of someone looking at something they are glad to have made. The tool was a leatherworker's edger, a small curved blade set in a handle of dense black walnut, worn smooth on one side where Opal's thumb had rested for 30 years. It was for finishing the edges of cut leather, for drawing it along the sharp corner of a strap or a panel, to produce a clean bevel that would not fray, would not catch, would hold its line through years of weather and use. It was not a valuable tool by any objective measure, but it was the tool Opal had used for her entire working life, and it fit Clover's hand as though it had been made for her. She kept it in her satchel after that, wrapped in a piece of the oilcloth Opal had always used to cover her workbench, and she would not have traded it for the shop itself. The household she had been working for, when things fell apart, was a family in Luling named Caldwell, a prosperous landowner named Henry Caldwell, and his wife Frances, and their 2 grown sons and a daughter not yet married. Clover had come to them at Opal's recommendation 2 years earlier, to do leather work for the family's horses and tack room, and to take on whatever other work the household needed. She had been useful and reliable, and had given them no reason for complaint. The reason she was told to leave had nothing to do with her work. The older Caldwell son, a man of 30 named Prescott Caldwell, had decided over the course of the winter that Clover's presence in the household was a problem, and that the problem was not her competence but her indifference to him. Prescott Caldwell was accustomed to women who responded to his attention. Clover had not responded to it, had in fact looked through him with the particular blankness that people reserve for things they find not worth the effort of disliking. And he had taken this personally, in the way that men who have never been ignored tend to take it. He told his father, on a morning in March of 1883, that Clover had been insolent, and that she had damaged a piece of good harness through carelessness, neither of which was true. Henry Caldwell was a fair man in business, but a man who did not question his son in front of others, and he told Clover that afternoon, in the courteous tone of someone delivering bad news he did not personally endorse, that her services were no longer required. He gave her 2 weeks' wages and an extra $1 for the road, and looked at the floor while he said it. Clover took the money and thanked him, which she did not have to do, but which cost her nothing and left nothing behind that could be used against her. She packed her satchel. She wrapped Opal's edger in its oilcloth. She walked out the front gate of the Caldwell property on a March morning when the bluebonnets were just beginning to show at the edges of the road. And she did not look back, not because she was not angry, but because she had long since learned that anger was a fire that required fuel to burn, and she was not willing to spend what little she had keeping it lit. She was 22 years old. She had $11.40, a satchel, a blanket, a change of clothes, and a leatherworker's edger with a black walnut handle. She had no address, no references she could use without going back to people she did not want to face, and no plan that extended past the next 24 hours. She walked south and west, because the road went that way, and because she had heard, from a freighter who had stopped at the Caldwell place the previous autumn to have a girth strap repaired, that the Blanco River country was good land, not too dry, not too crowded, with enough ranching to keep a leather worker employed if she set up shop somewhere sensible. She walked for 2 days. The first night she slept in a dry wash under a live oak tree, with her satchel under her head and her blanket pulled up against the cold that came down hard after dark in that part of Texas even in March. She lay awake for a while, listening to the coyotes somewhere to the north, and the wind in the cedar, and the faint sound of the river, which she could not see yet but could smell. That particular mineral sweetness of moving water over limestone. And she felt something in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but something between them, the sensation of having let go of a rope and not yet found the next handhold. The second day she followed the river, and by late afternoon she came into a small town called Bertram's Crossing, which was 2 streets wide and had a livery stable, a general store, a church, a schoolhouse, and a scattering of houses behind cedar rail fences with dog-trot porches. The general store was run by a man named Silas Ogg, who was 68 years old, and had the manner of someone who had heard most things already and was not surprised by the remainder. Clover bought a tin of sardines and a square of cornbread with 15 cents, and asked if there was call for leatherwork in the area. Silas Ogg looked at her hands, which were calloused in the particular way that leatherworkers' hands get calloused, with the right thumb more than the left, and the first 2 fingers of each hand worn smooth at the tips from pulling thread. He looked at her eyes, which were level and not in a hurry. He said, "There's the old Dunbar mill, 4 miles up the river. County's been trying to get rid of it since the flood took out the dam in '78. Last price was $11. That's not a price for a building. That's a price for the county to stop worrying about it." She asked him what condition it was in. He said, "Roof's mostly standing, walls on the west side are sound. East wall came down in the flood. It's limestone, mostly. The stone's good, even if the building isn't." She ate the sardines and the cornbread, and then she asked him for paper and a pencil, which he supplied without comment, and she wrote down the name of the county land office and put the paper in her coat pocket and thanked him. She walked the 4 miles up the river road in the last of the afternoon light, following a track that ran between cedar breaks and limestone outcroppings above the river. And she smelled the mill before she saw it. That particular smell of old water and stone and the ghost of grain, the smell of a place that had been used for something productive and now held the memory of it. The mill sat in a grove of cypress trees at a bend in the river where the water slowed and spread before narrowing again around a limestone shelf. The dam was gone, just the foundation stones remaining in the river, visible in the low water as a dark line below the surface. The wheel housing was still standing on the north side of the building. The wooden wheel itself rotted away, the iron axle still in its mounts, dark with rust but solid when she pressed her hand against it. The building was limestone, like Silas Ogg had said. 2 stories, built low and thick the way working buildings are built, when the person building them cares more about function than appearance. The west wall and the south wall were intact. The east wall had come down in the flood, and the rubble lay where it had fallen, partially obscured by 7 years of cedar seedlings and dewberry vines that had grown up through the stones, as though trying to reclaim them. The north wall was standing, but had developed a lean, not a dangerous one, not yet, but a lean that needed attention before the next hard rain. The roof was cedar shake, and roughly half of it had held. The west half, sheltered by the intact walls, was still sound, the shakes dry and tight and gray with age but not yet rotted through. The east half, over the fallen wall, was open to the sky, the rafters bare and bleached white as old bone. Inside, the west room, the dry room, had been the grinding floor, and the millstones were still there. The runner stone had cracked across its face and been pushed to one side, probably by the force of the flood. But the bedstone beneath it was whole, a massive disk of Boer limestone 2 feet thick that had not moved. The floor was stone, and it was sound. Clover walked every inch of the property, She pressed her palms against the limestone walls and felt forgive for the hollow sound that means a wall is failing. She found none on the west side. She walked the roofline with her eyes and calculated what would need to come off and what could stay. She looked at the timber framing inside, the heavy cedar posts and beams that had supported the upper floor, and found that 3 of them were still standing straight and true, the wood harder than iron with age, cedar being a wood that does not rot if it stays dry, and these had stayed dry. She went back to Silas Ogg's store the next morning and asked him where the county land office was. He told her it was in town 12 miles east, and he said, "You're going to buy it, aren't you?" She said she was. He looked at her with the expression she was becoming familiar with, that combination of doubt and something that was not quite respect, but was reaching for it. He said, "It's a hard project for one person." She said, "Most things are." She borrowed his mule and rode to the land office and came back in the late afternoon with a deed written on county paper with her name on it, Clover Hatch, and the Dunbar Mill on the Blanco River, 4 miles north of Bertram's Crossing, in exchange for $11 in back taxes paid in full. The clerk had looked at her, the way people look at someone they expect to fail, with a certain protective sympathy that is really just distance, and she had folded the deed into her coat pocket and thanked him and ridden back through the cedar breaks, with the river visible below her, silver in the late light, and felt the strange, clean weight of having done something that could not be undone. She slept in the dry room of the mill that night, on the stone floor with her blanket and her satchel, and the river made a sound through the open east side of the building, like something enormous breathing slowly in the dark, and she lay awake for a long time listening to it and looking at the stars through the gap in the roof, and she thought, "This is mine, not borrowed, not assigned to her by someone who could take it back, bought with the last of what she had earned, with her own hands in a house that had discarded her as though she were something left out in the rain." She began on the west wall first, because that was the wall that mattered most for keeping the roof that remained on the roof. The mortar in the upper courses had weathered, and in some places fallen away, leaving the stones dry stacked and vulnerable to any serious push. She mixed new mortar from limestone dust and creek sand and water, the same materials the original builders had used, and she repointed the joints with a trowel she found in the rubble of the east wall. Its handle rotted away, but its blade still sound after she cleaned the rust off with a piece of sandstone. On the 4th day, she was working on the interior face of the west wall, troweling mortar into a section where the original plaster had cracked away, and the stone behind it had gotten wet and soft when the trowel went through. Not through stone, through something behind the stone. She stopped and pressed her fingertips against the wall and felt the difference, the slight hollow resonance of a space behind the surface. The stones in this section of the wall had been set differently from the rest. She could see it, now that she was looking. The joints were tighter, the face of the stones more carefully dressed, as though someone had taken particular care with this one section of an otherwise utilitarian wall. She worked the mortar from around the edges of a stone about the size of a bread loaf set near the floor, and it came loose without much resistance. Behind it was a cavity about 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide, lined on the bottom and sides with pieces of old canvas oilcloth that had been carefully folded and pressed into place with obvious deliberateness. The oilcloth was brittle with age but had kept out the moisture, and inside it she could feel the shape of things. She did not rush. She lifted the oilcloth package and carried it to the doorway where the light was strongest and set it on the ground and knelt beside it and unfolded it slowly the way you handle something someone has kept carefully, with the respect that care deserves. Inside were 3 things. The first was a leather roll, the kind a craftsman uses to carry tools, tied with a strip of rawhide. She untied it and unrolled it on the ground. Inside were 6 leather-working tools, a head knife, 2 swivel knives of different sizes, a beveler, a modeling spoon, and a mallet with a turned hickory head. They were old, but they were fine tools. The steel dark with age but not rusted through, the handles smooth and fitted. Someone had made these, or bought them from someone who made things well and had used them for a long time. The second was a small tin box with a hinged lid, the kind used for tobacco, and inside the box, packed in cotton wool that had yellowed but not disintegrated, was a ring. A woman's ring, silver, set with a small oval of turquoise that had kept its color, deep blue-green, the color of the river when the sun hit it at the right angle. The silver was tarnished, but the stone was perfect, and the band was engraved on the inside with 2 words in letters so small she had to tilt the tin toward the light to read them. It said, "Keep going." She held the ring in her palm for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, which was slight, and the intention behind it, which was not. The third thing was a letter, folded into quarters and wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth and tied with a piece of brown thread. She unwrapped it and unfolded it, and the paper was heavy stock, the kind that lasts, and the handwriting was large and slanted, and in places pressed so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly cut through. She read it there, in the doorway of the mill with the river behind her, and the light coming strong and level off the limestone walls. The letter read, "My name is Vera Dunbar. I am writing this in the month of November, 1877. In the mill my husband Asa and I built together in the summer of 1859, the year before our son Emmett was born, and 2 years before everything changed. I am 51 years old. Asa died in the spring of this year from a fever he caught while working the dam repair after the April rains. And Emmett is in Austin now working as a surveyor, and does not know yet that I cannot afford to keep this property through another winter. I do not tell you this for sympathy. I tell you so, you will understand what it means that I am sealing these things into this wall." The tools in the leather roll were my mother's. She was a leather worker by trade, trained by her father in Kentucky, before she came to Texas with my father in 1843. She worked leather her entire life, took in repairs and made saddles and cut harness and mended boots, and she was better at it than most men who did the same work, and was paid less for it her whole career, which she accepted without bitterness, because she said the work itself was the payment, and the money was just arithmetic. She died in 1871 and left me these tools. I do not have her skill. I tried to learn and found that the patience for fine work is something you are either born with, or you are not, and I was not. So I have kept them carefully, oiled and wrapped, because they are hers, and because I could not bear to sell them. The ring was Usa's gift to me on our wedding day. He did not have money for anything elaborate, and he knew it, and he apologized for it, and I told him not to. The turquoise came from a Comanche trader who came through in the spring of 1859, and Asa traded a repaired rifle for enough stone to have the ring made by a silversmith in Bexar. The engraving was his idea. He said he chose those words because he believed they were the most useful 2 words in the English language, more useful than love you, or be careful, or even I'm sorry, though those all had their place. He said that most of what he had gotten through in his life, he had gotten through by simply not stopping, and that he wanted me to have that reminder close. I have worn it every day since he put it on my finger. Taking it off now is the hardest thing I have written yet. To whoever finds this, I do not know when you will come, or what will have brought you to this building. But if you are here, and you have pulled this stone from the wall, then you are someone who is willing to look at what is broken and try to understand it, and that is more than most people will do. Take the tools. Use them if you have the skill, and if you do not, find someone who does and give them freely, because good tools want to be used and it is a waste for them to sit in a wall waiting. Take the ring, wear it or keep it close, and when the days are long and the work seems like it will not end, and you cannot see yet what you are building toward, read what Asa had put inside it. He was right. He was right about most things, which I did not always tell him while I had the chance. As for the mill, Asa and I were happy here. The work was hard, and the money was never quite enough, and we lost more than I have space to write. But we were happy in the way that people are happy when they are doing what they are meant to do in the place they are meant to do it. This building deserves someone who will use it for something. It was built to grind grain, and it can be built to do other things, and the stone is good, and the timbers are sound on the west side, and the river does not lie. Make something here, that is all I ask. Make something that will last. Vera Dunbar, in her own hand, November 1877. Clover read the letter twice, and the second time her eyes went to the ring in her palm, and she read the engraving again. Keep going. And she sat there in the doorway of Vera Dunbar's mill, her mill now, with the river running behind her, and the cedar trees moving slow and heavy in the wind, and she pressed her hand against her sternum and breathed until the tightness there eased into something she could manage. She did not cry right away. She cried later, in the dark, lying on the stone floor with her blanket over her, and the leather roll of Vera's mother's tools beside her satchel, and the ring on her right hand, which was where she put it, on the index finger, where she would see it when she worked. She cried quietly and for a long time, and when she was finished, she felt scoured clean, the way you feel after a hard rain, when the air is clear and the ground smells like itself again. She did not spend recklessly. She was not a woman who had ever had abundance, and she understood what Opal Dunmore had taught her about resources. That they were not for impressing people, They were for sustaining work. She went back to Silas Ogg's store the next morning and bought what she could use. Nails, a coil of rope, 2 panes of glass, a sack of mortar lime, a pound of coffee, cornmeal and salt and dried beans. She paid from the coins she had left after the land purchase and felt the specific, unfamiliar sensation of buying things without calculating whether it would leave her unable to eat. She told Silas Ogg about the mill, about the walls that needed repointing, and the roof that needed patching, and the east wall that needed to be rebuilt from the rubble already on the ground. She did not tell him about the letter, or the tools, or the ring. She mentioned that she was a leather worker, and that she intended to set up a shop in the building once it was weather-tight. He listened with his hands on the counter, and then said there was a man named Gideon Foss, who lived 2 miles south of the crossing, who had been a stonemason before his hands got bad, and who might be persuaded to advise on the wall work if she asked him directly and fed him lunch. Gideon Foss was 70 years old, with hands that were swollen at every joint from years of working stone in the cold, and eyes that were still sharp and quick and missed nothing. He came to the mill on a Thursday morning, walked the perimeter without speaking, pressed his palms against every wall, looked up at the roofline, bent down to examine the rubble of the fallen east wall, and stood up and said, "Those stones are all still good. East wall can come back up. Take most of a summer if you're doing it yourself, but it'll come back up." She said she intended to do it herself. He looked at her hands the way Silas Ogg had looked at her hands, reading the evidence in them, and nodded. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that, not to do the work himself, because his hands would not allow it, but to look at what she had done and tell her what needed correcting and what was right. He did not charge her for this. When she asked him why, he said that Asa Dunbar had once helped him lift a lintel stone that he could not have lifted alone, and that he considered the account open. A woman named Patsy Grayle, who ran a chicken farm half a mile down the road, appeared at the mill one afternoon, with a pot of pinto beans and a skillet of cornbread, and set them on the millstone without ceremony, and said she had heard someone was fixing up the old Dunbar place, and thought they might need feeding. She came back the following week with a jar of pickled okra, and the week after that with a length of good cotton muslin. She said she had too much of. She never stayed long, and she never asked for anything in return. And Clover came to understand that this was simply how Patsy Grayle moved through the world, distributing what she had, without making a production of it. A man named Rupert Taine, who ran cattle on the land east of the mill, stopped one morning and watched Clover mortaring the east wall from horseback, and then dismounted without being asked, and spent 2 hours helping her lift the larger stones into place, saying nothing beyond the minimum required to coordinate the work, and riding off afterward without having given his name. She learned it from Silas Ogg later. A girl of about 12 named Ida, whose last name Clover never learned, began appearing at the mill on Saturday mornings, drawn apparently by pure curiosity, and began helping without being asked, carrying mortar and passing tools and fetching water from the river with a bucket she brought herself. She never explained her presence, and Clover never questioned it. On the 3rd Saturday, the girl brought her younger brother, who was 8, and mostly got in the way, but who Clover found she did not mind. The weeks moved into months. The east wall came back up slowly, one course of stone at a time. Clover working from the rubble on the ground, and building upward, setting each stone the way Gideon Foss had shown her, with the weight over the joints below, and the face dressed smooth and the mortar packed full. No voids, no air pockets. No places for water to collect and freeze and push apart in winter. The work was slower than she wanted, and harder than she had expected, and she went to sleep every night with arms that ached from her fingertips to her shoulders, and woke every morning and did it again. She patched the roof with new shakes she split from a cedar log that Rupert Taine had dropped off one morning with no explanation, cut from a tree that had come down across his road. Gideon Foss told her how to split them, how to read the grain of the cedar and set the froe and mallet so the wood parted clean, and she split 400 shakes in a week and nailed them in staggered courses over the east half of the roof until the building was closed to the sky again. And the sound of rain on the cedar was the sound of shelter, which is the best sound a building can make. She built a workbench along the south wall of the dry room, from cedar planks she cut from the same log, and she set Vera Dunbar's mother's tools out on it in the order she preferred to work. And she looked at them for a long time, the head knife, and the swivel knives, and the beveler, and the modeling spoon and the mallet, and she took them down one by one, and oiled them with neatsfoot oil, and sharpened what needed sharpening, and hung them back on the small pegs she had cut into the wall for the purpose. And beside them, on a separate peg, she hung Opal Dunmore's edger in its oilcloth wrapping, and these two inheritances sat together on the south wall of the old Dunbar mill, representing two women she had loved and one woman she had never met but already recognized. And she felt in their proximity something she did not quite have a word for. Something like lineage. Something like the understanding that skill does not die with the person who holds it, that it passes on through hands and tools and patient instruction, and that what Opal had given her was not just craft but continuation, a thread in something longer than either of them. By August, the mill was weather-tight. By September, she had a working space. By October, the first ranchers from the surrounding area began to appear at the door with broken harness and worn stirrup leathers and saddles that needed rebuilding, because word travels fast in ranch country when there is someone new who can do good work. And she did good work. She charged fair prices, and she kept to her word, and she handled every piece with the same care Opal had taught her, the care of someone who understands that what they are making will outlast them. She kept an account at Silas Ogg's store and paid it monthly. Gideon Foss came by every week or two, not for any specific reason, but to sit on the millstone outside the door and drink the coffee she kept hot and watch the river and say very little. Patsy Grail kept coming with food, transitioning from pinto beans to pumpkin and then to sweet potato pie as the seasons changed. Rupert Tane brought her a young mule in November, saying he had more animals than he needed, and that the mill road was a long walk if you had to go to town for supplies. She tried to pay him, and he refused, and said the Dunbars had let his grandfather water his cattle from the mill race for 20 years, and he considered the debt still running. Ida, the girl with the bucket, turned out to have a real aptitude for the work, a steady hand, and a patience beyond her years. And Clover began teaching her on Saturday mornings the way Opal had once taught her, starting with the simplest cuts and building from there. On an evening in late December, when the cold had come down from the hill country and the river was low and clear and very loud over the limestone shelf below the mill, Clover sat at her workbench in the light of 2 oil lamps and worked on a saddle she had been commissioned to rebuild from the tree up. The fire she had built in the small stone hearth she had constructed in the corner was burning low, and the room smelled of cedar smoke and neatsfoot oil and the particular dry sweetness of worked leather, which is the smell, she had decided, of productive work, the smell of something being made. The ring was on her right index finger, the turquoise dark in the lamplight. Opal's edger was on its peg above the bench. Vera Dunbar's mother's tools were laid out in their order, and the letter, Vera's letter, was folded in the breast pocket of her coat, which she had begun carrying it in after reading it through several times on different days, and finding each time that it said something slightly different than she had remembered, the way good writing does. She thought about Vera Dunbar, who had built something here with a man she had loved and lost it to a river and a hard winter and the arithmetic of grief, and who had sealed what mattered into a wall and asked whoever came after to make something lasting. She thought about Asa Dunbar, who had put 2 words inside a ring because he believed they were the most useful words he knew. She thought about Vera's mother, whose name she did not know, and whose hands had worn these tools smooth, who had worked leather her whole life in a country that paid her less than she was worth, and who had done it anyway because the work itself was the payment. She thought about Opal Dunmore, who had seen a 15-year-old girl splitting wood in a farmyard and recognized something in her that the girl had not yet recognized in herself, who had given her, over 4 years, not just a skill but a way of standing in the world, a way of meeting what came at her without flinching, with her hands open and ready. She thought about her mother, Bess Hatch, who had kept a dry sense of humor and wet hands, and who had told her the world gives you what you are prepared to take care of. She was not wrong about that. She had not been wrong about very much. Clover did not think about Prescott Caldwell. He did not deserve the space, and she had learned, in these months of solitary work and early mornings, and days that ended with her too tired to do anything but wash her hands and eat and sleep, that the mind is like a workbench. You can clutter it with everything that has ever been done wrong to you, or you can keep it clear for what you are making. And she was making something. She could feel it under her hands and see it in the walls around her and hear it in the sound of the river and smell it in the cedar smoke and the oil. She set the saddle aside and sat for a moment, with her hands loose in her lap, listening. The river, the fire settling, the mule shifting in the lean-to she had built against the south wall of the mill in November, stamping once in his sleep against the cold, the wind in the cypress trees. She looked at the tools on the bench. She looked at the ring. She looked at the walls she had rebuilt with her own hands from stone that had been lying in a pile for 7 years, waiting for someone to see them as a wall again, rather than as rubble. Keep going. Clover Hatch was 22 years old when she walked out of the Caldwell gate with $11 and a satchel and a leatherworker's edger wrapped in oilcloth. She had no home, no one waiting for her, no road that led anywhere she knew. She bought a ruined mill on a river bend with the last of what she had, a building most people in the county had written off as a monument to bad luck and rising water. And inside the wall of that building, she found what a woman she had never met had put there for safekeeping. Tools, a ring, and a letter that said, "Make something here." So she did, and if this story settled something in you, pass it along to someone who might need it today. And we'll leave you with this. What is it that you have been walking past, week after week, that is waiting for someone to pull out the stone and look at what's underneath? We think you might already know.